Well, I suppose it was potentially in my mind, but it was really, I suppose, when I was 15 and Father Burke Savage ran the Debating Society in Belvedere, said that it's a career I should look to at some point in the future. My recollection is he just aimed to be Taoiseach, but he had no memory of that in later life. Perhaps I invented that part.
And were you an ambitious schoolboy?
Well, yes, but I was tending to be distracted from what I should be doing by all kinds of other interests. My parents worried about that I would pick up so much useless information I might never get anywhere. But in fact, the useless information often turns in handy.
You were the last child that your parents had. Your mother was hoping for a girl, is that right?
She was, and was desperately disappointed when I wasn't a girl. Went out for several months to the continent. Her health was also affected by the birth, and went to Switzerland and to Monte Carlo, to the casino there. She liked gambling, rather uncharacteristically in every other respect. She seemed rather straight-laced, but I was looked after for the first couple of months by an aunt and cousins in Bangor, County Down.
What, your mother, a gambler? She, as a Presbyterian, that was a contradiction, was it not? Well,
yes, but she was also, of course, a suffragette socialist Republican, which again, for a Presbyterian daughter of a Belfast unionist businessman, was a bit against the tide.
And how aware were you of that mixed background? Your mother an Ulster Presbyterian.
Well, I was aware of it because, you see, as children, our contacts were with our cousins who were either Northern Protestants, Presbyterian Church of Ireland, or London Irish Catholics. They were our cousins. They came and stayed with us every summer, Christmas, Easter, different times. So I was very conscious of that. And I had the experience then when I was quite small of saying something pejorative about Protestants. My mother said, looking down from the floor, you do know I'm a Protestant too, dear, don't you? And that was a lesson for me.
Now, when you were growing up, your father was a government minister. How aware were you of that?
Well, not very, because he ceased to be minister when I was 6. So I must have had some awareness of it, but it was more when he ceased to be minister, and I saw more of him, because he was at home much more. Then I became conscious of a change, yes, in that respect.
And was it it was painful for him, wasn't he? He remained bitter about the Civil War and about the treaty divide, didn't he?
Yes, he never forgave De Valera. He wasn't bitter about others. In fact, we were great friends. The McEntee family were great friends of ours, and they were often at our house. So politics didn't necessarily divide families from each other. But he didn't forgive De Valera what he saw as his having been persuaded for personal reasons, he thought, to go against the treaty, having told Griffith to get him out of the straitjacket of the Republic. So there was always a problem there.
And how did that manifest itself?
Well, when De Valera's name came up, it was not well received, put it that way.
Both your parents were out in 1916, yes, and very involved, and yet they took different sides on the Civil War themselves.
Yes, my mother, like most women, except some wives of ministers, was Republican, and remained so for quite a few years afterwards, to the late 20s, I think till after Kevin O'Higgins' murder, which I think may have affected her. She was also, as a Presbyterian, very impressed by the integrity of the first government, and that brought her around. So by the time I had any consciousness of politics at all, there was no division between them. But there was a difference. My mother wrote to my father, when he was in America in 1935, saying he was in danger of allowing his anti-communism to make him insufficiently tough about the Nazis and fascists. So she was more to the left, and he was a very conservative Catholic. Though after Kristallnacht, I was very clear what side we were on.
Were you aware in 1932 that your father had lost power, had lost the election?
I have no memory of that, but I do remember that I saw much more of him from then on. Indeed, that June we went and holidayed together, my next brother and my parents, in Daniel. We've never done that before. And so that life improved in that respect. And that with my next brother, Ferguson, all his romantic ideas, and so on. And the fact that our house was full of people. At the weekends you'd have, especially in summer, but also in winter, parties. Then my elder brother's friends from college would come out. There was no alcohol of any kind. It was all on lemon juice, pure lemon and tea. And nobody seemed to complain. It was, and then our cousins coming in from London and Belfast. So it was a wonderful time. I had a very happy and full childhood.
Privileged, some would say, idyllic even?
Oh, privilege and idyllic, yes. Because, in fact, I suppose the period my parents were best off, the latter part of the period in government, and the money lasted for a few years afterwards before we had to leave this lovely house and grounds, and then we became less well off as time went on. So my childhood coincided with the best part of the family's life in economic terms. And my elder brothers, their experience was being dragged around to prisons in Britain or Ireland to see their father. It was a somewhat different background.
And what about your social life growing up? What are your memories of that?
Well, we lived in Bray in a house south of Bray, and there weren't many other children around, but there was a school there. But the school was one where my mother apparently asked them to keep me on after First Communion when the other boys left, which was then the tradition in some of these schools. And I was then for 4 years in a school with girls only. That had a very considerable effect on me.
In what way?
Well, 2 ways. First of all, they tended to gang up on me to some degree, but individually I got on well with them, so I said, you pick one girl and you married her, and that was that when I was 8. And at the same age, the King of Yugoslavia and the French Foreign Minister were assassinated in Marseille, and at 11 o'clock at the change of classes in mid-morning, the teacher mentioned this, and some of the girls seemed to know about it, and I failed to hide the fact that I didn't. So I was so humiliated as a male that I said I'd read the paper from then on to keep in touch with international affairs. So my interest in international affairs and my decision to get married early both came at age 8.
And did this young woman know that you had this intention towards her?
I don't know. It did later on when we were in college, but then in second year in college, her interest went elsewhere, and I had to review my position. I proposed to Joan several months later.
Growing up, in terms of hobbies, you say that were you really alone then? Your brother, your next brother was 6 years older,
yes,
wasn't he?
And he was a very powerful influence. He was very romantic. So we had to study the hieroglyphics and write hieroglyphics to each other. He went into the National Library when he was 13, copied out the grammar and syntax and much of the vocabulary of the Quichua language of the Incas of Peru, and I had to learn to type. 2 fingers and a thumb, and I never got any better at it since.
He'd recruited you as his manservant, had he?
Yeah, well, to type out a fair copy of what he had written down in a red notebook. We had the Aztecs as well, all kinds of things like that. He and I joined the New Astronomy Society in Dublin when I was about 8 or 9. I was also registered with Anoiga. I don't remember going any hikes at that stage. I was too young. So his interest became my interest, and he was very influential in the games we played and in the interests we had.
What sort of games?
Oh, well, the paths in the garden were used to simulate the French railway system. We had King Arthur, the knights, with bows and arrows, and cows I found were great targets because you can't miss them, and the arrow doesn't hurt them, and they don't go very fast. So bows and arrows, firing at the cows in the fields was also another pastime.
What about team games then?
Well, no, there weren't any team games then, obviously, at that stage of my life. When I went to Belvedere, I was asked to go and play football, and I went out to play in Grand's Palmerston Club, which is near Milltown Park. But my vague recollection is that they seemed to expect me to run after the ball. It seemed to me at age 10, it's a bit old to be running after things. So I opted out immediately, and never very keen to run anyway. I used to score for the cricket team, and once they were so short they put me in, and I hit a ball to the obvious astonishment of everybody, so nobody caught it. And I made 1 run not out. That's my entire sporting career. And I have to say in Belvedere, we weren't pushed into being. We were pushed into praying for our team to win, which I had theological objections, but not into play.
Did you express them?
Oh, yes, I did. I pointed out to the priest that either the prayers worked and were unfair, or didn't and were pointless. I didn't get anywhere with the Jesuits in that. We were playing Black Rock, I can tell you.
Just no response?
Yeah, well, I found when I expressed theological views, they didn't go down very well with the Jesuits.
And were you interested in religion then at that point?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any interest in becoming a priest?
Never. And the Jesuits were so wise, they never thought of asking me to do so, or suggesting it. They knew that I was destined for marriage, I think.
At Belvedere, you were 2 years younger than your class, is that
yes.
right? Yeah. Was that a mistake?
No.
Was that not a hothouse atmosphere then?
No, on the contrary. It meant that I had to work hard to survive. And I never went first in class. I get like 4th or 6th or something like that. That was very good for me, I think. Kept me on my toes. The trouble was, of course, when I finished, I was too young to go to UCD. That was a problem. My mother entered me for Trinity, but it was a problem. My father was a very conservative and orthodox Catholic, so he would not let me go to Trinity without the permission of the Archbishop. He also had trouble with the Archbishop because the Archbishop had closed down a society, the Mercier Society, in 1942, to bring Catholics and Protestants together. And he was too annoyed with the Archbishop to ask him. So I was sent back to school for a year, which was a nuisance at the time. But it meant I did philosophy in Belvedere, which was a useful addition to my interests.
What about choice then of career in terms of going to university? What did you decide to study?
Well, really you have to go back a bit because the choice of career came first. And the university was in a sense irrelevant to it. When I was 12, I definitely decided I wanted to be an Aer Lingus and to help run the airline. Of course, the airline then had 12 people, a box of tools and a biscuit tin, and one canvas plane, I think. So it was a bit premature. But by the time, of course, I left university, it was a substantial airline, and I was able to fulfill my ambition. Secondly, at 15, then the idea of politics. So they were the two careers I fixed on. But as regards university, well, I was not a science person, so it was languages, and so I chose in... I did 9 subjects in first year, I think, examined in 8, and in second year then I decided I would do 3 subjects rather than 2 and have, I thought, a better choice of possibilities of getting a good degree, and I did French, Spanish and history. History was my main interest and had been since the later stages of school. And
at UCD then, Charles Haughey was there at the time,
yes.
Your contemporary of his.
Yes.
Did you know him?
Oh, we knew each other, certainly, but he was... we had different interests. I was LNH and Law Society. He did speak occasionally at the LNH. He was more Commerce Society. SRC, Student Representative Council. He was always with boys in first year, all of whom were the sons of uniformed ministers. I was always with girls. And of course, at that time, we were very divided on the war. I had been deeply pro-Allied and anti-German throughout school going there, whereas many of the students would have been so anti-British they'd be pro-German. So we were divided politically also.
Without knowing a lot about the war, they said Britain's enemy is my friend.
Oh, yes, this is only 20 years after the War of Independence, and in Belvedere, too, many of the students were anti-British, pro-German. Many of the teachers were. French teacher wasn't. The other late teachers were, and some of the clerics were. And I fought that battle. I mean, I copied out the part of Brenda Sorge, Pope Pius XI's encyclical about the Nazis, and I still have the notes, and used it in the schoolyard to propagandize against the Germans. But I always felt I was a minority.
And did you take an interest in the course of the war?
Oh, yes, enormous interest. You know, I have a box somewhere, I have 150 maps I drew of the war at the time. My parents were so concerned, the mention of the war was such, they thought I wouldn't get a good degree. In fact, in March of '45, they sold the radio to stop me listening to it. But I just went to friends' houses and listened to it there.
And how informed could you be at that time? Because after all, those censorship...
Very well informed. Yeah. Well, the censorship, but not on the facts. You got the communiques of both sides. You used to know what was happening. And also we got the Daily Mail for some reason, as well as Irish Independent, I think at the time. Perhaps Irish Times, I'm not sure. And the Catholic Herald. So we did have a lot of input from the British side as well as they probably were getting through the censorship here. And, of course, listen to the BBC all the time, every night at 9 o'clock.
Your student days, Garret, at UCD, the 1940s, this was a very sheltered Ireland. Ireland was neutral, the war was going on, and a very conservative society. Were you aware of how sheltered it all was?
Well, yes. I was outward-looking, but society was very inward-looking.
And what was UCD like? I
was very relaxed, great fun, not too much pressure. I mean, I did all these subjects, but I didn't actually work very hard. I had a wonderful time. After release from 7 years in an all-male school to meet all these girls, it was wonderful. I really got a lot out of it, every way. And then, of course, meeting Joan, proposing to her in the second year, and she accepted me some months later. So that side of my life was on course.
And your father, your parents perhaps, thought that you were getting married too young, did they?
My father was very opposed. He had worries. My previous brother, my next brother, was in the army and was married, and they all joined the army in May 1940 from college once the Germans invaded France, and not finishing their degrees, and he worried about that. So he didn't like the idea of getting married young, and there was difficulty. Father Burke Savage came and talked to him, but he didn't like a young Jesuit telling him what he was to do about his son. Happily, it all worked out, because then when I got into Aer Lingus and got a job, he was opposed to that, thought I only did it to get married, not realising I was passionately interested in air transport. And for 2 months, he didn't speak to me. And then he sort of realised that I was genuinely interested, it was more than just marriage. and did speak to me. He died a month later, so we had a good month before he died.
And how close had you been to him?
Well, very close. Very close indeed, and very influenced by his views, politically, historically, theologically, and sharing his conservatism then and for another 10 years or so afterwards. Only when I started teaching in UCD later on that my views began to move to the left.
So how conservative were you? You were anti-communist at that point, weren't
Yes,
you?
I was.
Yes. As Ireland was, really.
Yes, I got in some trouble. I wrote an article on that subject which brought 3 libel actions. So I learned a lesson from that as a journalist later on, part of my life. It was only in the late 50s coming to teach in college, and with my own children growing up and with the students challenging my views, that I realised the conservatism I used did not stand up to scrutiny.
But you were 12 when you wanted to join Aer Lingus.
Yes.
You had that sort of ambition. Now, it was only 2 years old at the time, but it was still a pioneering aviation story when you joined, wasn't it? I mean, it was still a very young company.
It was, yes. They had just moved to all-metal aircraft. There was still a seamstress on the staff whose job had been to sew up the planes that they got torn, the canvas. And one of my first jobs was to allocate leave allowances to people. I gave her 18 days, and I and my friends who joined at the same time 18 days, and other people more or less accordingly. It was the first responsibility I ever had. But then I was sent to the sales department. I'd been no use in selling anything. You know, what on earth to do? My interest was in making it an efficient airline. So I began to produce timetables, estimates of traffic, and the company got mad. They'd opened routes to places where there's no traffic at all. I remember going to my boss in November of '47 and saying slightly sarcastically, in view of the fact that no paying passenger had travelled between Shannon and Paris in any of the last 3 weeks, the flight going twice a week, would they consider reviewing the flight? There were staff travelling for nothing, but no paying passengers, so that was cancelled.
You've been described at this moment when you're still a young man as rather juvenile in manner,
Yes.
full up with yourself,
Yes.
and a good deal of a prig. Now, that
Yeah.
description is by yourself in your autobiography.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So,
But I think the fact that I was so interested and that I had ideas of estimates of traffic which turned out to be right, ideas for scheduling the aircraft, so they let me do this from this position. Then they brought me into head office after a couple of years, but said, don't tell anybody what you're doing. We won't give any title. It'll upset the people who are supposed to be doing the work. The following year, I was put in charge of timetables. The following year, I got rates and fares, advice on routes to be planned. In fact, I took initiative on route planning, and then some advice on choice of aircraft and that. So by the age of 25, I had really was in a key position for all these areas of the economic aspect.
strategic planning, really.
Yeah, which was very exciting.
You know, it's sometimes been said of you, it's a sort of a joke about Garret FitzGerald, oh, that works in practice, but Garret will ask, but does it work in theory?
Never.
No?
Never theoretician.
Is that unfair?
Totally. It's the opposite truth. Because I knew no theory. Had to invent a theory as a basis for decisions, but I was not a theoretician at all. I was the practical thing. Getting the turnaround time down to 20 minutes. I did that 50 years before Ryanair did it, with smaller aircraft, of course.
And throughout this time, you were beginning to work as a freelance journalist as well.
Yes, I wrote a few articles when I was 20 or 21, but when I was 22, I was stuck in bed with chicken pox, time of the 1948 election. My mother gave me the Writers and Artists yearbook with the names of newspapers. So I wrote articles and sent them off to various parts of the Commonwealth. And 2 of them were published in South Africa and India. So I decided there's money in this. So by the time I was 23, I had a chain of 14 papers. I was the Irish correspondent, 10 in the Commonwealth and 4 in provincial Britain. And I began writing for The Independent. I had a weekly column on foreign affairs, which I used to leave Aer Lingus, go down to the National Library, get down to the Encyclopedia Britannica, last edition, Keysing's Contemporary Archives, which update, and by happenstance I've an article written into them. And I did other articles from too on things like tourism and that. But eventually they dropped the column, I think, in my article that I wrote that said tourism was too dull, and the one on the decline in the teaching of Irish in the universities was too controversial. So I went to the Irish Times in December '54, and they took me on. And it was Jack White, the features editor, who said, if you can do something on tourism, you can do something on government finances and so on. And he pushed me around. Well, what about the thing called national accounts? What are they? I had no idea what they were, but I found out. And so I became an economics correspondent.
And how did you then join the UCD staff?
Well, that's complicated. In 1958, I decided at the time it was time to move on. The EU had been established, Treaty of Rome signed in March '57. We would eventually be joining. It seemed to me that in the early decades at least, Irish agriculture could benefit hugely from joining, because Britain could no longer exploit us with a cheap food policy, prices would go up. But that the obstacle was going to be Irish industry, which was incredibly inefficient. And if we couldn't join because industry couldn't cope, that would be a terrible blow to us. So I decided I'd leave Aer Lingus and move into that area. UCD, well, it wasn't ready to take me on at that time, but I got a position in Trinity, and I did an analysis there of the inputs into Irish industry. And that meant I had to contact 250 firms and visit 50 of them. My calculation was that when then, a year or two time, when Lemass came to power rather than De Valera, the economy began to open up, that the industrialists would know about me as an industrial economist. All other economists talked only about agriculture. The debate on the political report in the Statistical Society, 5 people talked about agriculture, only Donal Nevin talked about industry. So I placed myself there. And as a result, when Lemass told the Federation of Irish Industries to start, do some preliminary work, look at how an industry would survive in free trade, it was I and another UCD economist were asked to do the job. And then when we completed that task, so for the wool and worsted industry, I put into the report that it took us a year. The 23 industries at the time, we'd never get ready in time unless industry and government worked together. And I proposed the two would get together. And I contacted Ken Whittaker, Secretary of Finance, and that was done. So in July of '61, the Committee on Industrial Organisation was established at my suggestion, and from then the whole of Irish industry was reviewed, and that led into the second programme of expansion, the economic planning. So for the 60s, I was working, amongst other things, for the Federation of Industries as their consultant. And that was getting a lot of very relevant experience for politics.
And did you realise at that point, did you expect that Ireland would inevitably join the European Union?
That's why I left. I think it's not expectation. I planned it carefully.
And politics. You have written in your autobiography that you were uncertain which political party to join.
Well, yes. Fianna Fáil asked me to join them. Charlie Haughey wrote me in '61, and I said no.
Did he actually ask you to join?
I have a letter somewhere from him, actually, yes. I thought it was verbal, but
to draw you into the maw of the party is how you put it in your memoirs.
I see, yes.
Yeah.
But no, I felt that Lemass was the man we needed to start economic growth. And I voted Fianna Fáil in the '61 election. I voted for Sean McEntee rather than John A. Costello in his constituency, because I thought Lemass would be better for us at that stage than Dillon. But I didn't think Fianna Fáil, people like Haughey coming forward, would really have the concern for the social development of the country, and that they were great for economic growth at that stage, but not for what you do with the growth when you got it. So it was a question of Labour and Fine Gael. And between the two, in Fine Gael I would have more influence, Fine Gael background, but also the party would be more easily shifted. Labour tied down by trade unions, in that respect conservative, be more difficult to shift. And if I could move Fine Gael into a more progressive position over time, then with Labour a government could be formed. That was so I joined Fine Gael for those very practical reasons, as well as partly sentimental ones. But it would have been difficult not to. But it seemed to me that it was the...
You had baggage, and it was going to look better in Fine Gael, wasn't it? It was going to be more useful in Fine Gael.
And I thought the party was open to shift its position, whereas Labour would not be so easy to shift.
James Dillon was leader when you joined.
Yes.
But he didn't stay for very long.
No, on the contrary. I stood for the Senate. I was to be candidate in the Dáil, but I chickened out on that in '65. I never quite knew why. Joan was against it, and I was uncertain myself. At the last moment, I said I wouldn't stand. I had to find somebody else a candidate here. And then after the election, Declan Costello and Alexis FitzGerald, John A. Costello's son-in-law, a very close friend of mine, they said I stand for the Senate. And I did. I went around the country and I got sufficient votes to be elected. I wasn't very popular because my election displaced the party's main fundraiser, Ned Maguire Brown Thomas. And towards the end of the campaign, I actually stopped looking for votes, hoping I wouldn't put him out. One of the very few people standing in the Senate who did not complete the process. And I got 64 votes, he got 40, and I got the seat.
Now, you must have been disappointed that Liam Cosgrave was the man to succeed James Dillon because you wanted to change the party.
Well, no, because Liam Cosgrave was seen at the time as being a reformer in the party. But as against
Were you not
that,
hoping that Declan Costello...
Yes, I mean, I would have hoped for Declan Costello being the leader. But there wasn't seen to be such a difference between them at the time. But that all happened when I was out canvassing.
So it was a quick change once Dillon resigned?
A very quick change indeed, yes, done immediately.
And yourself and Declan Costello were close then. What were your intentions for the party if you could change it?
Well, we'd known each other since we met in school debates in university. And Declan had the previous year put to the party need to change towards a more social democratic approach. He, in fact, was threatening to leave the party. I think his father said to him, look, you can't leave without telling them what you want them to do. If they say no, fair enough. But they said yes. And I actually went to see him at lunch with him, and he told me this was happening. He said, hold off now to see what happens. And then the party did accept his proposals, and we then got down to write up all these policies during the following year before the Senate election came, the Dáil election.
And when you told Ken Whitaker, the senior civil servant in finance, and a mentor by now, wasn't he, that you were going into politics, and that was your intention, you shocked, markedly hostile, you say, was his response?
I wrote him. I thought I ought to tell him this was happening. And he wrote back, rang me up, I'd forgotten one way or the other, and said, that's a great mistake. You'd lose all your influence if you went to politics. I've often teased him about that afterwards.
He thought you could be more influential from the outside?
Yes, because my economic commentary in the Irish Times and was at that stage quite influential, I think, and he thought, well, that would be lost. He didn't see the possibility of doing much in politics.
And what did you see as the possibility at that moment?
Well, I hope within the party to influence it so that it would become, as Declan Costello wanted, more social democratic, and later on I also wanted to be more liberal in some ways, and that if we could shift the party in that direction, there could be change in Ireland, because politics is about change. The only point of going to politics is to change things. If you don't want to change things, why bother? If you want to change things, then you need your party to shift direction. You don't join a party because you agree with it. It's a rather static view. It seems to me you join it because through the party you can influence change.
And were you optimistic that change was possible then?
Yes, I was. Declan Costello, other people who supported his views, and it was clear there was a wind of change in the party, although the other people were more conservative, and that had to be, argued out in due course. And it was argued out.
And was Lemass not a very formidable figure at that moment for you to be optimistic that Fine Gael would be making the changes? Well,
yes, but Lemass was then in his mid-60s. I don't expect him to retire just as soon as he did, but he wasn't going to be there indefinitely. A new generation were moving in Fianna Fáil, and there were aspects of that worried me. Whereas I thought in Fine Gael, knowing some of the younger people there, that we could shift the party and move towards government, perhaps the next election in '69. But then Labour said the 70s would be socialist and rejected coalition then. So that was a disappointment in '69. But then in '73 it happened.
And have you ever regretted the decision to go into politics?
No, never. It was the right thing to do. I was perhaps unfortunate and disappointed to find myself in government when there was no money to do anything, and all we could do was cut spending and raise taxes instead of doing the positive things I wanted to do. Any other time might have been better. But having said that, no, I never regretted it. And I was very happy indeed to find myself in Foreign Affairs in '73.
And looking back, how would you measure your impact on politics here?
Well, I think it did help the process of Fine Gael and Labour coming closer together. And we were in government then in the '70s and again in the '80s. My concern about Northern Ireland, which I always had, at a very deep level, I had a chance to do something about that. On Europe, I wanted us to move towards more political integration in Europe, because I thought that would suit a small country like us, wouldn't be bossed and exploited by larger countries, and that our whole country should be more pluralist and open. I was able to contribute to each of these things in different ways over time.
Your constitutional crusade, for instance, do you consider that a success?
In the longer run, yes, but when I came back into government after a brief interim of 9 months, everything had changed. The IRA threat in Northern Ireland, support for it was growing so rapidly. I had to change tactics and concentrate on trying to change British policy in Northern Ireland rather than concentrate on changing things here. So the changes in this state, becoming more pluralist and open, and our nationalism becoming one that could accommodate unionists as well, all that came later. So it turned out to be premature at the time, but I think that nonetheless, the fact that I launched it then did help later on to move it along.
Embracing the liberal agenda, in other words, put that on the map. And even if you lost referenda, it was part of the grammar of our politics and eventually, inevitably came. Is that your argument?
Yeah, yes. The abortion thing was complicated and I didn't handle it well, but whatever I did, it didn't matter because once Charles Haughey backed it, he was going to go through with a quarter of the Labour Party and 8 Fine Gael people in favour. When the government, we were government in opposition, it was going to go through, but that was messy. We had the divorce referendum. Contraception we were able to effectively clear. And divorce referendum we didn't succeed with, but we cleared the way for another referendum in 10 years' time. And I thought that we needed to do something about divorce because in the absence of divorce, so many second unions were being created and children growing up with no recognition by church or state that we were destabilising marriage. And I saw a restricted form of divorce, a modest form of divorce is the best way to safeguard marriage in our society. That view was not widely held. That debate was carried on between people who said you have a civic right to divorce, which I can never understand, how you can have a right to repudiate an indissoluble arrangement, and the other side saying that it would open the floodgates and everybody get divorced, which is equally absurd. I couldn't get people to focus on what seems to be the real issue. What's the best thing to do for marriage?
Looking back on your life now, do you have any major regrets?
Well, I have regrets about people whose careers, one way or the other, I may have damaged, even if I may still think it was necessary to do what I did, but I could have done things better. So my regrets would be about people, a small number of people who...
Names?
So, no.
Do you regret the relationship that you had with Charles Haughey and the flawed pedigree when he was being nominated for Taoiseach?
Well, the wording was, of course, completely misunderstood. It related to the fact that he differed from all previous Taoiseach in not having the support of a large part of his own party. In that respect, it was flawed. But the choice of words was misunderstood. Nobody actually noticed what the context or the sentence it was in. And that was it. But I don't regret...
The words were also poorly chosen.
They were poorly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the words were poorly chosen because I had ended up writing that speech at 4:30 in the morning. And that was a mistake. But the opposition to his becoming Prime Minister, Taoiseach, no, I don't regret that. I thought that there would be problems with him as a Taoiseach. You
met him recently?
Yes.
Why?
Well, we've known each other for, 63 years now. He's been very ill, and I thought I should go and see him. And we chatted over old times in college and that. Himself and Maureen, we knew each other quite well at the time. One occasion, we went together to a parliamentary press gallery dinner. At least I went with Joan, he was there too. Maureen wasn't with him. And the seating put husband and wife together, so it was Joan, it was me, Joan, Charlie. So she looked at the seating and said, Charlie, I'm stuck between you and Garret. I have no intention of talking to Garret all night. You'll have to use some of your celebrated charm on me. So they spent the evening talking about who married whom out of college and who divorced whom.
Was that meeting at his invitation or your suggestion?
I didn't see it. I didn't know what he'd want to, but he did, yes. And I was very glad I went. It was a very nice chat about the past. I never have to say, we never had any difficulty at personal relationship. I've always found him courteous. I always had a good private relationship with him. I still feel that he was not the right person to be Prime Minister, but that's a political point. But it never affected our ordinary, courteous personal relationship, which was always straightforward.
And what's your view of Irish society today?
Well, if we'd got rich a bit slower and a bit sooner, might have been better, because becoming so rich so quickly is a bit destabilising in society. And inevitably, when that happens, the rich get richer faster, the poor get better off. And the division between incomes increases, and people become more individualistic, more materialistic. So there are some social consequences of the rapid growth of the economy, which are negative. But on the other hand, it is very important that all our young people know they can live in Ireland, have a job here. They may go away for a year or two, and many of them do, get experience and come back. But the old system when people had to emigrate was absolutely intolerable. I've never been able to accept or cope with the idea of somebody having to leave their own country and live elsewhere. I've always had huge emotional difficulty with that. So to have changed that has been wonderful.
And Garret FitzGerald, the big picture, how would you assess your impact on Irish politics?
Well, I'm the worst person to do that. Other people have to do that. But basically, on Northern Ireland, Europe, and on making our country more open, more pluralist, and opening it to the possibility of North and South coming together in a positive way, they're the things that interested me most. But I was also happy to be able to do something in government in terms of social policy.
You celebrated your 80th birthday. You're still working. You're still writing.
Yes, what else would I do? If you can write and talk, well then, and you can then contribute something once you go on doing so. And I'm didactic. I like to teach, whether by writing or by speaking. And there's always things that interest me, things I want to look into and tell people about. And it's great to have the opportunity to do that.
Is that the key, Garret, that you're a teacher?
Yes, intellectual curiosity, which has led me down all kinds of stray directions during my life, and the desire to communicate to people and to inform them and to change things.
And do you think about the next world?
Not much.
Do you fear death?
No.
No. You intend to keep going?
Yes, you keep going till you stop, yes.
Garret FitzGerald, thank you very much.
If you would like to join